Um, my name is Julia Madore, and I am the Associate Director of Exhibitions at Fenimore Art Museum and Fenimore Farm. Mostly, I wanted to start early just so I can make sure everybody can hear me. If someone wants to throw like a thumbs up into the chat, that would be greatly appreciated. Otherwise, it is now 2 o'clock, and I am happy to introduce you and welcome you to the In the Spotlight Women Artists at the Fenimore Art Museum virtual tour. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my video off and share with you the PowerPoint and narrate through the show. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know you can hear me. All right, so I'm going to stop the video and you'll see my PowerPoint. So thank you again for joining me on this new tour. I'm really excited to walk you through the women artists we have in the collection. A little bit of context. I came up with the idea for this tour after the success of the 2024 exhibit, As They Saw It, Women Artists Then and Now. I was inspired by the overwhelmingly positive reactions to that show and wanted to take a deeper dive into the collection and to the women artists whose work we steward. I'm happy to take questions at the end of the PowerPoint, and you can just toss them in the chat and I will get to them. Otherwise, here we go. So to start us off, I've got the two works in our collection that probably have the biggest name recognition. Georgia O'Keeffe on the left and Mary Cassatt on the right. And this is a bit of a bait and switch, and I do hope you'll forgive me, but we're actually not going to focus on these wonderful artists on this virtual tour. To learn more about them, you're going to want to join Anne Cannon's Masterpiece Collection tour. So this is the real start of this tour. And as truly amazing and talented as those two artists are, I want to focus more on the women we don't talk about as much and those who don't get as much recognition as they deserve. So we're going to pivot away from fine art for a bit and look closer at Native American art in the Thaw collection. The Thaw collection and pieces from the Folk Art collection. And where I find these two collections really intersecting is that while there are pieces made by women artists whose names were recorded, most of the art in these collections were made by women whose names were unrecorded. And we're on really sure footing that the pieces were made by women because there's similar other pieces by named women, or a particular piece was designated as women's work in the collection. But truthfully, we're never going to know a lot of the women that made these pieces simply because their names went unrecorded and they're just lost to time. So starting with the Thaw collection, and if you've seen my Thaw collection tour, you might recognize some of these pieces. Just to give us a bit of context, these are 6 pieces that are going to cover the geographic area we're going to talk about. So the Northeast, the Plains, the Southwest, California, the Northwest Coast, and the Arctic. Women in these communities were artisans. They did beadworking, weaving, painting, and although a lot of the pieces were made to be used, each piece is a unique testament to these women's abilities to turn everyday objects into works of art. The chief's blanket, for example, represents an evolution in artistic design within a long history of Diné girls learning to weave from older women in their community. These blankets were not made by the same hand, but they were made by women, with the younger girls learning by watching as the blankets were made. Girls were also involved in the process by raising and shearing the sheep, and then cleaning and carding and dyeing the wool. Chiefs' blankets became actively sought after by other Native Americans, collectors, and tourists. Women responded to the interest with the advances in design. So starting on the left, the one that's labeled T0122, that's a first phase blanket, and it's only got the horizontal stripes, and you've got 3 colors. And then as you move forward, as demand is growing, you have the blanket in the middle, T0123, where this second phase blanket, you're starting to add rectangular blocks of color. And then finally on the right, T0124, you have the third phase blanket, and that has the diamond shapes, the multiple colors, the stripes. So you can see that as these blankets became more and more popular outside of just the Diné culture, the women weaving them learned, and they taught themselves new techniques, new dyeing techniques. So you ended up with this much more intricately designed blanket than where you started with the phase one. Weaving has remained a large part of Diné culture, and in the Fenimore collection, this flag weaving was made by Laverne Barber in 1992 in honor of her uncle's military service. And over the centuries, the work of women, although inherently artistic, have transformed into a recognized art industry. A similar story plays out in the realm of beadwork. Most of our collection of historic beadwork was made by unnamed women, like this bandolier bag on the left. We have countless examples of bags, caps, and moccasins that are beautifully beaded without any record of who might have made them. Like the contemporary artist Laverne Barber, the pieces in the center and on the right are from the 21st century and are a continuation of Native women's beadwork. But these were done by artists whose names and practices are well established. Karen Ann Hoffman is an Oneida, Wisconsin beadwork who started beading later in life, but approaches it with honor for her Haudenosaunee ancestors. Carla Hemlock is a Mohawk artist whose work focuses on social issues facing Native Americans. Both women are again representative of a long-time artistic tradition done by unnamed women, evolving into a widely recognized art form. This next object actually has a slightly different story. These moccasins were made around the late 1830s by a Wendat woman who embroidered the intricate floral motifs that were widely sought after in the tourist market. These moccasins were labeled as artist unknown until they went on exhibit at the Minneapolis Institute of Art for their blockbuster show, Hearts of Our People, in 2019. And Hearts of Our People was a show of entirely Native women artists, from historic pieces to contemporary. It was a gorgeous show. And when we loaned them, the curators at Minneapolis, they were researching our moccasins, and they actually came to the conclusion that these moccasins were likely made by a woman named Marguerite Vincent Lawanaki. Marguerite supported her family through her needlework, selling mainly snowshoes and moccasins that she embroidered with moose hair and porcupine quills. She successfully developed the local economy around embroidery production. By 1879, almost 30,000 moccasins were annually made by her and her employees from nearby families. The reasoning behind this artistic attribution is because these moccasins were a part of a gift presented to Lord Elgin, the Governor General of Canada, during his residency from 1847 to 1854. Marguerite's work was among that gift, and the Minneapolis curators believe, based on the provenance in comparison to her other work, that these moccasins were made by her or one of her workers. So this is a success story in that the moccasins that we once had labeled as artist unknown were eventually attributed to a named artist. It's not something that happens really often, but it's very exciting when it does. And there is a picture of Marguerite. Honestly, I think it's astounding that we have a picture of her, considering she basically lived 1830s to 1900-ish up in Canada, but that is her, and that's the woman that most likely made those moccasins. I want to mention one more Native artist before moving to folk art. Like the chief's blanket, pottery in the Southwest was a way of life. Ceramics were made by generations of women, some of them now housed at Fenimore Art Museum. But like the blankets and the northeastern beadwork, much of it was done by unnamed women. In the early 1900s, a potter named Maria Martinez actually made a space for herself in the tourist market and the art market with her black ceramics. She's an excellent example of an earlier Native woman artist whose name was synonymous with high-quality art. Maria's work became known starting in 1907 when she was encouraged by a collector to recreate Santa Clara Pueblo pottery using shards from excavated pots. Later, she became even more renowned for her black ceramics with black design, so like the jar on the left. And this was a technique that she and her husband worked on together. Her husband, Julian, was also responsible for the painted designs, like on the jar on the right. However, it's really Maria who receives most of the credit for this work, as she's the one who experimented with clay in order to revive the historic techniques. So I'm going to shift to folk art now, another area of American art that really flourishes in the Fenimore's collection. And I want to start out with continuing with the theme of talented but unnamed artists, and a lot of them tend to be done by young women who were students at female academies. Along with general housekeeping lessons, girls at these academies learned embroidery, watercolors, and received exposure to literature from English and European cultures. Works like these are wonderful examples of the skills girls learned in school, but all four of these pieces are unsigned. The blue house on the left, that combines watercolor and calligraphy, two skills girls definitely would have learned. And the house is portrayed in a very rigid style that is reminiscent of cross-stitching, another skill learned at school. Liberty at Niagara on the top center. It's done in watercolor, and this time the artist, who was probably a schoolgirl, was painting the symbols that would have defined a lot of her life. The female embodiment of liberty is holding a liberty cap on a liberty pole at the site of one of America's best-known natural features, Niagara Falls. Symbols of liberty and America were everywhere in the early 19th century as the nation was finding its feet after the Revolution. And I couldn't not include this wonderful watercolor of a girl holding a cat's paw on the bottom center. To me, this is something that binds cat lovers together across generations. Just like my phone is full of cat pictures, which is very true, I really like to think that the girl who made this just really loved her cat and wanted to document him. Sadly, we don't know the artist's name or the cat's name, but it's very likely that a schoolgirl made this drawing using her lessons from school. And of course, the Venice watercolor on the right, that was the inspiration behind the 2022 exhibit Unmasking Venice. This work is a great example of the exposure to other cultures that schoolgirls would have had. This watercolor of Venice was most likely inspired by or directly copied from a print of the city on water. But notice how the artist made the drawing similar to her own life in New England, visible in how she dressed the figures in typical New Englander clothing of the period. This leads us to believe that she never went to Venice, but experienced the city through a text or souvenir drawing. From here, we are moving into art that is by named artists. We're still in the realm of schoolgirl art, but we have this watercolor and embroidery piece by Sophia Burpee. Besides her name, we know that she was born in 1788 and died in 1814 at the age of 26 from typhoid fever. And like I had mentioned before, girls who attended school had access to literature from foreign countries. This scene is taken from the poem Autumn, published in England in 1730, and shows the moment Paleman recognizes Lavinia as the long-lost daughter of his friend. This piece combines the knowledge of literature with the skills Burpee learned in watercolor and embroidery. And finally, these three pieces by Juliet Miles show the variety of scenes a schoolgirl artist might have felt confident making. A self-portrait, or perhaps a portrait of a friend with a still life in the background, a small landscape accompanied by a poem in her very neat script, and on the right, a horse riding scene, maybe taken from her own experience or maybe taken from something she read about. So again, three really common examples of what a schoolgirl would have learned to make when she was in school. These girls were probably drawing for their own amusement and to practice their skills learned in school. However, there were plenty of women who created art for the purpose of financially supporting themselves and their family. Eunice Griswold Pinney was probably one of these women. Her first husband died from drowning while they were actually in the middle of a divorce. And after she remarried, she began painting and probably selling mourning and interior scenes like these. The memorial on the left is actually dedicated to herself with the date left unwritten. Memorial scenes were very common in the early 19th century, and women painted and embroidered them to honor departed friends and relatives. Ruth Henshaw Bascom was another married woman who took up painting to provide an extra income for herself and her husband. She traveled to other areas to draw portraits on commission, and according to her journal, she made over 1,000 portraits for money. Her figures tend to have very soft, curvilinear forms, as you can see here in Eliza Jane Fay's swept back hair, round earring, and scalloped collar. What's really interesting about the portrait of Eliza is her locket memorial for George Washington. This was a typical locket for girls and women during the Victorian period, as memorializing Washington was a way to honor the great founding hero of the nation. Washington died in 1799, and even though this portrait was completed around 1840, the cult following that Washington had continued to mourn for him well into the Victorian period. These next two pieces were designed by Anne Butler in the early 19th century. Anne's father owned a tinware shop known as the Butler Shop in Greene County, New York. Aaron and his sons produced household tinware items, and Anne and her sisters painted the floral decorations. Anne was in charge of decorating by the time she was 15 and probably taught her younger sisters to paint. Although there are multiple tin pieces known to have been painted by Anne, this is the only floral still life to be known by her. After economics, religious and spiritual expression are two of the main reasons people, including women, turn to art. The painting on the left by Minnie Evans was inspired by the garden at the house she worked at. Evans was deeply spiritual, and the garden was an earthly reminder of Eden. She often created smaller compositions and then cut and paste them into a larger piece. The painting on the right is by Sister Gertrude Morgan, who experienced religious revelations between 1934 and 1956, the final experience urging her to paint in service of the Lord. Morgan dressed almost exclusively in white and illustrated scenes from scriptures and the book of Revelation, so she's in the middle of the couch in that scene. In this piece, she shows herself in white as the bride of Christ, and she's surrounded by words of faith. Bessie Harvey is another artist who took inspiration from religion, calling her work a collaboration with God and nature. She used roots and branches embellished with paint and costume jewelry to create masks and figures. Her African heritage is clearly reflected in her work, and her mission to deliver the message of interracial harmony and Christian brotherhood to the world is also very clear in her pieces. While not quite a religious expression, these next few artists looked inward and used their experiences and self-reflection to process and express their life stories and how they managed to endure some of the circumstances in their lives. Inez Nathaniel Walker was born into poverty in South Carolina in 1911, where she worked in back-breaking labor on a farm until she migrated to Philadelphia in the 1930s as a part of the Great Migration. She was convicted of manslaughter after killing an abusive male acquaintance and was sentenced to prison from 1971 to 1972. Walker began drawing as a way to isolate herself from bad influences while in prison. Her drawings are almost always portraits of women, many of them based on herself. Clementine Hunter's ancestors were enslaved people in the American South. She spent a majority of her own life doing both field labor and domestic work on Melrose Plantation in Louisiana. Her art was inspired by day-to-day plantation life, depicting hands at work, at church, and at play, as well as religious images like the painting in the center depicting a Black woman as a crucified Christ figure. To me, this painting is an expression of the labor of Black women and, of course, the horrors and cruelty of the American slavery system. Mermaid by Mary Ann Wilson is a favorite painting at the museum, enjoyed by both visitors and staff. I've always read this painting as Mary Ann's expression of her true sexual identity. She lived on a farm with a close friend and probable romantic partner, Miss Brundage, in the early 19th century. And yes, their close friendship was embraced and accepted by their community. However, that doesn't mean their true relationship, if they had one, was out and open to the public. So traditionally, mermaids are depicted as this ultra feminine figure, but instead, Mary Ann has created a half mermaid and half Amazon warrior, replacing the traditional mermaid comb and mirror with an Amazonian bow and arrow. The tail is also interesting as the scales appear like quilting squares, quilting being another traditional feminine pursuit. So it's kind of mixing up a whole bunch of different identities into something that is traditionally a very feminine, very female projecting figure. The next theme I would like to cover in folk art is immigration. There are a lot of artists in our collection who were not born in the United States, but immigrated to the country later in their life. The piece on the left is by Karolina Denek, a Polish immigrant who survived World War II and spent several years living in a displaced persons camp in Germany before coming to the United States in 1950. She settled in a Polish neighborhood in Worcester, Massachusetts, and worked in a shoe factory while selling jewelry on the side. In retirement, she began oil painting and adding jewelry to her Madonna and Child scenes in reference to the gilded and jeweled icons of her native land. Bertha Halazan left Austria in 1956 to seek work and better education in the United States. She worked as a physical therapist and sang at Carnegie Hall in New York. She began painting after receiving a set of oil paints from a friend, and the Statue of Liberty became a central enduring theme in her work. Her paintings symbolize her love for the United States, and in this painting, you can see the reference she makes to her past life in Austria with the girl in the drindle on the left. In Sabbath Dinner, Melka's eldest shows a scene that is autobiographical and unmistakably shows her Jewish heritage. Here, Melka's mother raises her hand in prayer over the meal, while a young Melka watches from the table. Melka spent part of her life in New York City before moving to Israel for much of her childhood, and then returning to the United States later in life, giving her a perspective of her heritage from two different vantage points. Finally, we have a couple of women who arrived in the art world later as self-taught artists. In Queena Stovall's painting on the left, Fireside in Virginia, the artist's husband has fallen asleep in his easy chair while two girls warm themselves by the fire. In her own words, Queena Stovall describes the scene as, quote, an old Virginia custom. It was the first place people went in cold weather to warm themselves and catch up on the latest talk, end quote. Queena was born Emma Serena and didn't start painting until 1949 at the age of 62 after taking an art course at a women's college in Lynchburg, Virginia. Over the next 31 years, she painted about 50 works documenting the lives of her family, friends, and neighbors. And of course, probably best known for picking up the paintbrush late in life is Anna Mary Robertson Moses, better known as Grandma Moses. Sugaring off is perhaps her favorite subject as she returned to it again and again. It was inspired by the Currier and Ives lithograph of maple sugaring. Her technique was to gather magazine and newspaper clippings, trace the outlines, and then fill in the basic details. Grandma Moses did not start producing art in earnest until the age of 78, something I should keep in mind next time I complain about being almost 30. So I'm going to do a very quick spin through with the women artists we have represented in the fine art collection. And sorry, again, I'm not going to discuss Georgia O'Keeffe and Mary Cassatt because they're heavily featured in Anne Cannon's tour, and I really do recommend signing up for that one too because she's got some great stories. So the first artist is quite remarkable because she's actually a sculptor. I have a portrait of her in the middle. This is Helen Gertrude Soller. The painting is by a man, but we'll allow it because it's a painting of her. She was the artist who made the two sculptures on the left and the right, so Dancing Girl and Spear of Revolt. Helen studied at the Art Students League and was a member of the National Academy of Design. In addition to sculpture, she also wrote on art. After traveling to Europe, China, Japan, and Russia, she began exhibiting extensively in the United States. And the reason why I find her remarkable is because sculpture was such even more male dominated than just the regular art world of painting. This was even more masculine. So to be a successful female sculptor in this period, I think that's amazing. This beautiful portrait of Susan Vanderpool Ord was painted by Lydia Field Emmett around 1932. Lydia attended the Académie Julienne in Paris in 1884. Her family had experienced several severe financial difficulties after the Civil War, but managed to send Lydia to Paris from an inheritance from a cousin. After Lydia joined the artist colony of American artists in Giverny, France, the home of Claude Monet, she returned to the United States and she studied under William Merritt Chase. Although she is known for her portraits of children, Lydia preferred to paint portraits of adults as she found them more challenging. In this portrait, Lydia has depicted one of New York's elites with loose brushstrokes, and Japanese-inspired wallpaper, a clear influence from Chase. These next few names will surely be familiar to you if you're from the Cooperstown area. Red Barn, number 4 by Mary Buckley Perio, shows her incredible interpretation of American modernism. Her paintings combine intuition and feeling and references to post-impressionism and cubism. Much of her work surrounds themes on nature and memories. This particular painting is a series of 4, and the barn depicted belongs to Henry Cooper, a Cooperstown native and relative of James Fenimore Cooper. So this piece, there's a large triptych, which is the piece on the upper left. It is quite a few feet long. And then the 2 other pieces on the bottom and on the right, those are much smaller studies. And these are by Michelle Harvey, and they depict the dock at Ferry Springs, a local park in Cooperstown. She is a landscape painter who aims to use her skills as an instrument to show the connection between what is and the senses. This painting by another local artist, Susan Jones Kenyon, is an impressionistic depiction of Cooperstown from the north side of Otsego Lake. Her work points to the human need to find solace, inspiration, and refuge in nature. Finally, this barn painting by Tracy Helgelson was inspired by the natural beauty surrounding the farmhouse she lives and works in. In her own words, "I often paint the same scenes over and over, deriving great comfort from portraying what is familiar as well as noting the small changes that occur over time in my environment." This interest in depicting local landscapes through the arts is not a new phenomenon. Like James Fenimore Cooper pulled from the Otsego Lake environment, these women also used the beauty surrounding them as inspiration for their art. So this brings us to the end of the tour by works of women artists in the Fenimore Art Museum collection. So thank you so much for joining me, and a special thank you to museum members and to those who donated.